I'm not alleged. I did it. 6 words, spoken out loud, captured on a police body camera, in front of a uniformed officer, seconds after a 17-year-old boy was still receiving chest compressions on the grass of a Texas track field. That is where we are going. But to understand why those 6 words matter so much, why they may be the single most devastating piece of evidence in this entire trial, we need to go back to the beginning. To a high school track meet in McKinney, Texas. To a 5-inch folding blade. And to a teenager who, when given the chance to say absolutely nothing, chose instead to say everything. My name is not important. What is important is this. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly why spontaneous statements made in the moments after a crime are considered some of the most powerful evidence in American courtrooms, and why a defense attorney's worst nightmare is a body camera that was already rolling. Let's go. The Collin County Courthouse in McKinney, Texas, sits in one of the fastest growing suburbs in the country, a place that, until recently, most people outside the state had never heard of. Day 2 of the murder trial of Carmelo Anthony.
From the jury box, those jurors returned to the courthouse in McKinney, Texas today for more testimony in the track meet stabbing trial of Carmelo Anthony. Thanks so much for being with us as we follow day 2 today. We understand that the court is breaking for their lunch. That happened a short time ago. That means our eyes and ears in the courtroom. Cody Thomas, he is going to be able at some point to be able to join us from outside of the courthouse. He's been keeping us up.
Not the NBA player, a different young man entirely, began the way the first day apparently ended, with tears, with grief, with the particular kind of silence that falls over a room full of people who have seen something they cannot unsee. The 12 jurors who filed back into that courtroom on day 2 were not lawyers. They were not judges. They were ordinary people from Collin County who had already, by day 1's end, reportedly been seen wiping their eyes in the jury box. That detail matters. We will come back to it. On trial is Carmelo Anthony, a teenager charged in connection with the fatal stabbing of Austin Metcalf, 17 years old, at a track meet, a sporting event, the kind of afternoon that is supposed to be unremarkable, the kind of afternoon that parents attend without a second thought. Austin Metcalf did not survive it.
It's the first witness on the stand, 3 witnesses so far, first responder and 2 officers. The first responder was a firefighter and paramedic that pretty much testified to the severity of the wounds once he arrived to Austin Metcalf's body, and just talked about the intense life-saving efforts they went through trying to revive him, to which, of course, to no avail. But they talked about, attaching a machine to his chest to read a pulse, and he had no pulse. They said it was flatline. There was an acronym he used, a medical term, and the prosecutor asked for, simplicity for the lay people in the gallery, and he just said, yeah, he had no pulse. He was pretty much dead in a cardiac sense. They loaded him up into the back of the ambulance, to which, he eventually did not regain consciousness. But then we went on to see more from officers, and they were testifying about their response to
the prosecution's theory, as it has emerged across 2 days of testimony, is straightforward. Carmelo Anthony brought a knife to that track meet, used it with lethal intent, and then, in the moments after, made statements that undermine any claim of self-defense. The defense's theory is equally clear. This was not murder. This was a young man in fear for his life who acted to protect himself. What the body cameras captured that afternoon is, depending on which side you believe, either the prosecution's most powerful weapon or context that has been stripped of its full meaning. You are going to decide which one it is. The first witness of day 2 was a firefighter and paramedic, a first responder who arrived at the scene while Austin Metcalf was still on the ground. This witness did not testify about who did what or why. His testimony was about something more basic, more brutal. He testified to the wounds. He testified to the life-saving efforts, the machine attached to Austin's chest, the readings, the flat line. The medical acronym he used that the prosecutor, in a moment that is worth noting, asked him to translate for the jury. For the lay people in the room, he said. Just tell them in plain English." The paramedic obliged. In plain English, he told the jury Austin Metcalf had no pulse when he arrived. He was, in a cardiac sense, already dead. They loaded him into the ambulance anyway. They kept working. He did not regain consciousness. That testimony is not legally complicated. It is not procedurally interesting, but it is emotionally foundational. It is the prosecution establishing, through the most credible kind of witness available, exactly what the result of this case was before a single question of guilt or innocence has been answered. The jury needed to sit with that, and they did. Then the officers took the stand. The school resource officer, identified in recording from inside the courtroom as Eduardo Cortez, was among the most significant witnesses of the day. A school resource officer, for those unfamiliar, is a law enforcement officer assigned specifically to a school campus.
Sir, he described the arrest of Carmelo Anthony. He said an adult pointed out the suspect and said, "That's the guy." I called him towards me. I patted him down. I had him raise his arms and ordered him to walk with me along that fence line. He obeyed me. He didn't try to run away. I turned on my body-worn camera, had him place his hands behind his back, and had him detained. The thing that most shocked me was that a student brought a knife to a track meet, and this witness agrees that that alone was unprecedented. Then on cross-examination, this witness...
Kids streaming toward him, pointing. Someone's been stabbed. They pointed in Carmelo's direction. He approached the young man. He described what came next in terms that, from the outside, sound almost quiet. Carmelo obeyed. He raised his arms. He walked alongside the fence line as instructed. He placed his hands behind his back. He did not run.
Commotion when he ran out there to the scene, all the kids running to him saying, "Someone's been stabbed," and they pointed towards Carmelo's direction. And so you see on the body cam when he finally approaches Carmelo, and Carmelo seemed to cooperate. He was being very cooperative. He was being compliant. He didn't try to run away. But the key thing about this testimony here on the body cam, you hear Carmelo say to the officer, "He put his hands on me. I told him not to." And when he says that phrase, he clearly he's crying hysterically. You can hear him sobbing in a very emotional state. But the prosecution's harping on that last half of that statement, the "I told him not to" part, because the prosecution says that's simply a lie. We know we've heard that phrasing, "He told him not to put his hands on me," or "Put your hands on me and see what happens." That's the narrative that the prosecution's running with, and that eventually led.
That compliance matters to the defense. It is being used, and will likely continue to be used, to paint a picture of a young man who was not acting like someone who had just committed a murder, who was scared, yes, who was crying, yes, but who cooperated, who didn't flee. But here is where the body camera changes the texture of that cooperation. On the footage, you can hear Carmelo crying, sobbing, audibly distressed. And in that state, he says something. He tells the officer, "He put his hands on me. I told him not to." The prosecution's position is that this is not just a statement of distress. It is a reference to the confrontation. The moment, the prosecution argues, when Carmelo warned Austin Metcalf not to touch him, and then followed through on that warning with the knife. The prosecution contends this is not a frightened teenager describing what happened to him. It is a frightened teenager describing what he did. And if that interpretation is correct, then that spontaneous statement is not evidence of innocence. It is something considerably more complicated. But the 6 words that matter most come from a different moment on a different officer's body camera. Here is what you need to understand about spontaneous statements, because this is the legal concept at the heart of what Day 2 revealed. In courtrooms across this country, there is a category of statement called an excited utterance. The technical definition varies slightly by jurisdiction, but the principle is universal. When a person makes a statement in the immediate aftermath of a startling event, while they are still under the stress and excitement of that event, before they have had time to think, to calculate, to consult a lawyer, to construct a narrative, that statement is treated as particularly reliable, particularly honest.
Courts allow these statements into evidence precisely because they are considered the closest thing we have to an unguarded window into what a person actually experienced and actually did. Body cameras have made excited utterances more powerful than ever before. Not because they create them. Human beings have been making them for as long as there have been traumatic events. But because now they are captured, time-stamped, unedited. There is no dispute about what was said. The only dispute is what it means. On a second officer's body camera, played inside that McKinney courtroom with a jury watching, you can hear a moment that the prosecution clearly intends to be a turning point. An officer refers to Carmelo as the alleged suspect, and Carmelo responds out loud for the camera to capture. I'm not alleged. I did it.
Austin Metcalf. But there was another officer whose body cam was played during this officer's testimony where you heard the officer say, "We have the alleged suspect," and then you clearly hear Carmelo say out loud, "I'm not alleged, I did it." So kind of damaging to the defense's case here. But then we just heard from an officer who arrived who did not partake in any life.
Think about what that moment contains. A teenager in shock. A teenager who is crying. A teenager who at this precise second had no attorney beside him, no one coaching him, no one telling him what to say. And what he chose, without coaching, without counsel, without time to think, was to correct the record. Not to deny, not to invoke his rights, not to say nothing. To correct the word alleged. That is a spontaneous statement. That is an excited utterance.
Mr. Anthony in the moment of the event while it's still on his mind and heavy on his heart. So oftentimes these body-worn cameras, which capture the aftermath of the incident, are best evidence because they capture things that are said and things that are done before anybody has time to consult with an attorney and develop a defense to what the particular charges are.
Al, what do you think about the weight of that body camera? Because I do want to add some of the notes that we're getting from the courtroom that you can hear on it a handful of crimes.
And that is exactly why legal commentators watching this testimony called it plainly damaging to the defense. Now, stop here for a moment, because I want to ask you something directly. We are watching a case where a teenager is dead and another teenager is on trial. The knife that killed Austin Metcalf was 5 inches long. It was a folding blade, the kind that springs open with the stroke of a thumb, one-handed, fast. The prosecution demonstrated this for the jury in open court.
The knife, which a lot of people keep with them, that has a little blade, a bottle opener, things like that. So the big question is, what was this young man doing at this track event with this type of knife that it seems like he brought it maybe for a particular purpose? So that's the big question as to what he was doing with this type of knife, which is not what we usually see people walk around with on a daily basis.
Yeah, we keep hearing that question. Why did he have the knife? Now, there was something that came out today, Al, where on cross-examination.
Using the actual weapon. The jury saw it for the first time that day. They watched the blade swing out. They watched how quickly it opened.
And they did a demonstrative effort in front of this jury where they showed that the blade could be swung out really quick with just the stroke of a thumb. You could open it really quickly with one hand. But the impactful part of that testimony is that we saw the body cam from this officer where you actually see Austin Metcalf's pretty much lifeless body, everyone trying to give him chest compressions, but you see the body on screen, and that obviously brought out a visceral, emotional reaction from the Metcalf family. Plenty of tears and sobbing and consoling. And I looked.
The school resource officer, the law enforcement officer whose job it was to keep students safe at exactly this kind of event, testified that in his experience, a student bringing a knife like this to a track meet was unprecedented. That was his word. Unprecedented. Here is what I want you to think about. We know, because cross-examination confirmed it, that possessing a knife under 5 inches in Texas is not a crime.
Zero tolerance for having a pretend gun. You can't even bring a water pistol in some instances if it looks like a real weapon. So that is a zero tolerance policy. Okay, having the possession of the knife is not a criminal offense in and of itself. That's correct. Okay. But it's a school event. He's a student. He's there. He's got a knife, 5-inch switchblade.
It is legal to carry. The defense made sure that came out, and they were right to do so. That is a fact, and facts matter. But here is the other fact sitting right next to it. Legal to possess does not mean appropriate to bring.
Smells any, false rumors that it was a stake or something that was used for the sporting event that was going on. This is a knife. This is a knife that is a dangerous knife. And this is a knife that should not have been at a sporting event for a high school team. Perfect.
Lieutenant Gray, weigh in as well about that knife. What did you think about hearing that it's a 5-inch blade, that it was folded out?
That's my best friend. That's my brother. While trying to get to Carmelo. It captured, from a separate angle, the sight of Austin Metcalf on the ground with people trying to save him. Chest compressions, uniformed hands pressing down. And that footage reportedly brought audible sobbing from the Metcalf family inside the courtroom. The jury saw all of it. They saw the knife. They saw the body cam. They heard the children. They heard the statement. Now here is the question that the prosecution is planting in that jury's mind. And it is a devastatingly simple question. In all of that footage, in all of those spontaneous moments, in all of those excited utterances captured on camera before anyone had time to build a defense, what did Carmelo Anthony not say? He did not say they were going to kill me. He did not say I was afraid for my life. He did not say I had no choice. He did not say I had to do it, or they were going to beat me. He did not say I was defending myself. None of it. Not once. That silence is not nothing. That silence is the self-defense argument breathing its last.
I had to do this to be able to get out of there because they were going to take my life. They were going to kill me. They were going to beat me to a pulp. I didn't hear any of that. So the self-defense argument starts to kind of fade a little because that's at the moment when he's confronted by this officer and has the chance to say, listen, I did this because I had to. If I didn't, I would not have been able to get out of that tent. They were trying to beat me up. They were trying to do something to me. They were trying to kill me. You don't hear that. So
self-defense, in its simplest legal form, requires a reasonable belief of imminent harm. That is the standard everywhere. In Texas, the law gives defendants significant latitude under what is sometimes called the Castle Doctrine, the right to defend yourself with force when you reasonably believe you are in danger of serious bodily injury or death. That latitude is real. The defense will lean on it. But here is what experienced trial attorneys will tell you. The best evidence of whether someone acted in genuine self-defense is almost always what they say right after it happens. Not what their lawyer argues 6 months later. Not what they tell their family. What comes out of their mouth in the first 60 seconds? Before calculation. Before fear of consequences. Before they understand what is happening to them legally. When Officer Cortez approached Carmelo on that fence line, Carmelo was crying. He was emotional. He was, by every account, in distress. That is the moment, the exact moment, when a person who genuinely acted in self-defense would be most likely to say exactly that. Because in genuine self-defense, the fear does not disappear the instant the threat is gone. It spills out. It explains itself. It is the first thing out of your mouth because it is the only thing in your mind. What came out instead was, he put his hands on me. I told him not to. And then to a different officer on a different camera, I'm not alleged. I did it. No fear. No claim of necessity. No framing of what happened as something that was done to him. 2 statements, 6 words,
and a self-defense argument that, as one legal commentator put it, starts to deflate. The emotional weight of this trial is not abstract. It is not theoretical. It is two families in a courtroom in McKinney, Texas. One of them is watching footage of their child receiving chest compressions on a grass field. One of them is watching their child stand trial for murder. Both of them are living inside a tragedy that no verdict will fully resolve. The jury watched the Metcalf family weep.
Towards Carmelo Anthony's side, and it was pretty stoic. There was a pretty, a lack of emotion there, not necessarily in a negative sense, but just really take evidence here, all the facts of this case as the prosecution presents it thus far. That's the latest right now. I'll send it back to you.
Car, thanks to Cody Thomas for that report there in McKinney, Texas. Let's bring in our guests who are standing.
Reporters in the room noted that the Anthony side was, by contrast, stoic, present, attentive, absorbing the evidence, but not visibly breaking down. That observation was made without judgment by the journalist who logged it, and that is the right way to receive it. Grief does not have a dress code. Composure in a courtroom is not evidence of guilt, any more than tears are evidence of innocence. But the jury saw both, and juries are human. What happens next in this trial is still unwritten. We are 2 days in. The defense has not yet presented its case. Carmelo Anthony has not testified. We do not yet know what the defense will argue about the confrontation, about what Austin Metcalf did in the moments before the knife came out, about what Carmelo believed was about to happen to him. None of that has been heard yet. And that matters. It matters enormously. So here is what day 2 actually gave us, stripped of everything else. The prosecution built a wall, brick by brick. A paramedic who described a flat line. A school resource officer who called the knife unprecedented and confirmed the arrest was calm. A second officer whose body camera captured a 5-inch blade being demonstrated for a jury for the first time. And underneath all of it, 2 statements, 2 uncoached, unfiltered, excited utterances from a teenager who did not yet know he needed to stay silent, that the prosecution will argue tell the jury everything they need to know. I'm not alleged. I did it. Here is the lesson from today that goes beyond this case. If you ever find yourself in a moment of crisis, a car accident, a confrontation, an incident that may later be examined by a court, understand this. Everything you say in those first moments is being captured. Everything you do not say is also being captured. Body cameras are not just surveillance. They are time machines. They bring the jury back to the exact moment before anyone had a story, before anyone had a lawyer, before anyone had decided what the truth was going to be. That is why prosecutors love them. That is why defense attorneys fear them. Spontaneous statements are the most honest things most people will ever say in their lives.
Jay, that is always really important for jurors to see as much as they can. And here, they get to see the body camera not of days later when police catch someone, but right after it happens, this school resource officer is on the scene.
Right, and the body-worn camera presumably captures some spontaneous statements, excited utterances made by...
Because they are said before the person saying them understands the stakes. And sometimes, in a courtroom in McKinney, Texas, in front of 12 jurors who are already wiping tears from their eyes, the most honest thing a person has ever said is also the most damaging thing they have ever said. The trial continues.
Carmelo Anthony's side of the story. The state has rested its case in the murder trial of a track athlete who stabbed another athlete to death at a track meet. The question is whether what happened was murder or self-defense. We're one of the only media outlets in the courtroom giving you all the details of what is happening in real time. I'll also tell you why a witness's testimony caused the family of the victim, Austin Metcalf, to step out today. We're on the case presented by Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Today, the defense finally began telling its side of the story in one of the most closely watched murder trials in the country. With Carmelo Anthony's future hanging in the balance, his attorneys are now trying to reshape the narrative jurors have heard for days, offering a version of events that could determine whether he walks free or this teen spends years, if not the rest of his life, behind bars. But looming over the defense is a question that has haunted this trial from the very beginning. Why did Carmelo Anthony have a knife at a high school track meet that day? After days of testimony from prosecution witnesses, the defense called Anthony's track coach as its first witness, and from the moment he took the stand, jurors heard a different account of what happened in the moments leading up to the deadly confrontation. All right, before we jump into Carmelo Anthony's side of the story, I want to get with Court TV's Cody Thomas inside the courtroom once again today. Cody, let's talk about how the state finished their case. And they call a witness today who's kind of the link between Carmelo Anthony and Austin Metcalf. He was teammates with Austin Metcalf, knew Carmelo Anthony to some extent. His name is Eddie. Why was his testimony important?
So we've heard this Eddie character's name, Chris, throughout the entire duration of all the student witnesses that have taken the stand. He is the common denominator. We heard a lot of people saying Carmelo knew Eddie. He came over and dapped Eddie up, gave him a handshake. Eddie was a childhood friend of Carmelo's now ex-girlfriend. So that's the connection there. Now, based on all the testimony that the students brought up during the prosecution's case, they were all saying that Eddie and Carmelo looked like they knew each other. It was the obvious link. And that's what the defense kind of talked about in their opening statements. Of course, some people under the tent said they didn't know who Carmelo was, but they looked over, he was sitting next to Eddie. Everything came back to this guy named Eddie. All right. So I was thinking, as I've been sitting there for the past few days, that Eddie was going to be a defense witness, because if he's great friends with Carmelo, then obviously, he fends for his friend, I would say. But one thing I was thinking before he got called was, if he knew Carmelo, why wouldn't he stand up and let everybody know, when all the commotion started, hey, this is my friend, he's here with me, blah, blah, blah. Everything's cool. But never heard that from any of the students' testimony. But anyway, Eddie gets on the stand today. They're going through his testimony. He's about 5 or 10 minutes in. And then Eddie kind of all but says he knew who Carmelo was. They were cool, but he verbally said, I wouldn't say we were friends. It was just kind of someone that he knew. Okay, cool. Now we move on to the cross-examination by the defense. And this is, I feel, was a little bit of a win for the defense. They showed a whole bunch of pictures of Eddie and Carmelo at these different group settings, at Eddie's house, no less. There was 50th birthday parties for Carmelo's ex-girlfriend's mother. Remember, Eddie and the girlfriend, this girl named Valeria, they were the ones that knew each other, and Carmelo was, I guess, the third party, you would say. So when they had these family functions, Carmelo obviously was there. Okay, they showed some group photos, kind of establishing. Then, here's another defense win to me today. They showed photos of Carmelo and Eddie together. Just being teenagers goofing off. One is playing a guitar, they're making silly faces at the camera. So Eddie gets up there under direct examination saying, yeah, I know him, but, I wouldn't say he's a friend. But then the defense pushes back and is like, hey, if you're not friends, why do you have all these pictures together? But the crux of Eddie's testimony today, though, Chris, was that he definitely got emotional talking about Austin's death. He said Austin was like a brother to him. He said that on the stand. And when he was describing, everything that he saw that day, when he came back and saw Austin had a hole in his chest, he immediately choked up and started crying instantly. They had to walk up there and give him Kleenex. And there were some new people in the gallery today, Chris. There were 5 young boys, presumably former teammates, former classmates of Austin Metcalf. And when they were describing that as well, 3 of those 5 boys started crying themselves. And, these are, big football player-esque guys, and they were crying too, just showing the emotional weight that this still carries. And, Carmelo sitting there, he's taking it all in. I'm looking at him on his, at his table with his defense as this testimony is going on, still sitting there stoic. I don't know what's going through his head. I'm sure he's realizing the gravity of what's going down, but his defense, the state rested today. So his defense is up, and they've called 3 witnesses so far, 2 students included, one of those being one of Carmelo's friends too.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of time spent for both the prosecution and the defense kind of establishing why Carmelo Anthony was under this tent, because from the state's perspective, they've hammered this tent culture of track and field where it's you don't go under the tent of another school. But then with this Eddie character coming into play, the defense is really trying to show that Carmelo may have been invited under the tent. That's why he's there. I wonder just how much any of that matters, because I just think of if you're a juror, it's when do you enter the bubble of the information that matters, of the interaction when we talk about things escalating to the point where Austin Metcalf, maybe it's a hard shove, maybe it's a soft shove, That happens, and then you have Carmelo Anthony responding with this stab wound that eventually takes Austin Metcalf's life. And that kind of leads to a witness that came, one of the final witnesses for the state today, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy on Austin Metcalf. And before we talk about that part of it, I know you've been sitting kind of near the family of Austin Metcalf, and I know there's been body cam video, there's been 911 calls. I mean, it's just the weight of what they're going through. It's just hard to imagine. What did you see prior to that witness being called?
So, the student witnesses wrap up, and there was this sort of announcement. All the media, as you mentioned, we're all sitting behind Austin Metcalf's family. All 9 members of the media are behind them. So before this medical examiner comes up, there's an announcement that she's going to be the next witness, to which the prosecution turns around. If you don't want to see or hear about any of these things, I'd advise you to leave the courtroom, because now you're about to get into, the injuries and talking about them. And I was sitting there thinking we were going to see the injuries. We didn't. The jury got to see 4 pictures of it, but us in the gallery did not see those things, but they were describing it in detail. So anyway, the prosecution announces, medical examiner's coming in. If you don't want to hear any of this, go out. Austin Metcalf's mom gets up and goes out immediately, along with some other family members and some people in their camp as well. His dad, Jeff Metcalf, initially said no. He nodded his head. I was sitting right behind him. He said he didn't want to leave, and then the prosecutor kind of makes a face and just goes, "I advise you to leave." I could hear it was kind of a whisper. It wasn't, an announcement. It was more so a direct to him, to which Jeff Metcalf finally got up and left. And, we heard about this 2-inch gaping wound. She described gaping, and she described the difference between gaping and a slit-style stabbing wound. Where gaping is more of it's kind of like filleted open, not to be insensitive to it, but that's the way she kind of described it on the stand. And that it was a 2-inch deep wound that hit the cartilage of Austin Metcalf's sternum and actually pierced one of the ventricles in his heart. So he was literally stabbed in the heart, which is likely why the CPR and life-saving efforts weren't working, because no matter how much the heart was pumping out, it was leaking, from the source. So it was really establishing the gravity of the wound. And the jury, again, got to see 4 pictures. 2 of them were Austin Metcalf on the autopsy table, and 2 of them were the heart removed from the body. That's what the medical examiner was describing they were seeing. So, of course, I'd imagine that a family didn't want to hear that. So mom, dad, and some other people, I don't know who they were, maybe the aunts and uncles, maybe it's just family, friends, and supporters of the Metcalf family, they all got up and left, about 7 or 8 of them.
And I wonder, too, I know from the first responders who were there, the people who interacted with Carmelo Anthony right after all of this took place, where it seemed like he didn't think that what had happened was going to lead to Austin Metcalf's death. But then you hear about, the medical examiner, I think, straight up said something along the lines of, there's no way that he could have survived this. Even if he was on an operating table, a surgeon might not have been able to save him. The wound was that bad.
It absolutely was that bad. Those are the exact words that she said. And then one word that stood out to me, Chris, that she said, she starts describing the 5 manners of death, and to which she, classified this one as a homicide. And when she explained homicide to the jury, she said the intentional, bringing about of death by another human being. But the key word to that, to me, was, Chris, and I thought the prosecution would harp on a little bit, was intentional. It wasn't like accidental, it wasn't this and that. She said the intentional causing of harm that results in death by another human being. So I thought that was a powerful thing, that she said on the stand.
And you just wonder, too, a statement like that, just that one line. And then I also know from some of these student witnesses who have just very bluntly said they don't believe that this is self-defense. We're going to talk about the defense side of things here in a moment, and kind of from Carmelo Anthony's perspective, what they're trying to say. But you just wonder, over the last couple of days, with so many people just bluntly saying that to the jury, what impact that's going to have. Now, the state ends up resting. Before we get to the defense, I know that there was a quick motion that the defense raised right as the state ended up resting. What was that about?
Dude, guess how much it cost me to make sure my family gets $1 million if something ever happens to me? You'll never guess. I don't know. It's got to be $200 a month. Nope. $37 a month to protect my family. It only took me 10 minutes to get coverage. It was 100% online, and I didn't even need to take a medical exam.
That could help cover our living expenses. That could help put my kids through college if something happens.
Yeah, man. Ethos.com. It's super easy, and you can get coverage in just minutes.
Yeah, the defense immediately motioned for a directed verdict. And in layman's terms, that pretty much means that the defense tells the judge, hey, I don't think the state really proved their point beyond a reasonable doubt. And if it was granted, the judge would be like, you know what, you're right. And pretty much grant this in favor of the defendant, to which there would be a not guilty and the defendant walks free. But the motion was almost immediately denied. The prosecutor said a few words, maybe 10 seconds, and then the judge looked over to the defense, Mr. Mike Howard, and said, yeah, your motion's denied. So they tried for the directed verdict before they started their case. Then we took a recess and came back in for the defense to actually start their case.
Now, when it comes to the defense's case, the first witness they called was Carmelo Anthony's coach. And so we heard from Austin Metcalf's coach on the state side. What did he say?
He was talking about, they started off humanizing this defendant here, because let's not forget, we have a victim here, but this kid's liberty is at stake as well. He's claiming this self-defense and saying that, he feared for his life, which valid if he did. So this coach gets up there and he's talking about how Carmelo was this athlete who's on the football team, and they presented an exhibit of what they call the Captain's Awards at his school, to which you see Carmelo's name engraved as the captain in 2024 during his fall senior season. And they also pointed out that that is voted upon by the students, pretty much trying to show that, Carmelo Anthony is a reputable guy. He's somewhat of a leader. He looks like a leader to his classmates and his teammates. So they talked about that for a little bit, and then they got into the, we've heard the tent culture. That was what a lot of this has been, that phrase has been circulating around in the courtroom, talking about each tent is like each locker room for each team. Therefore, people should not be hanging under the tents. Well, this coach was saying, I get that, but at the same time, I guess it's the discretion of each coach. Whereas we had the coach from Memorial High School, that was the absolute first witness the second witness by the prosecution, talking about how, strict he is and how, he enforces his rules, and made that several student witnesses talk about how Coach Robert Starr, that's the coach for Memorial High School, has been strict. It's garnered some laughs inside the courtroom when they talk about how strict he was. But this coach here today was saying, there was times where athletes from another school would come under my tent when I'm there and, ask if they could be there. And I was like, yeah, we'll chill out and watch the 200 meters. But what the prosecution harped on during that, when they got on the cross-examination, was, he specified when you were there as a coach, as a supervising individual, versus, just the teenagers running free, because this coach also specified that they like to have a coach at the tents at all times just to watch teenagers, not thinking about crimes. You got boys, you got girls, you got a lot of hormones. You want to keep everything in line with a bunch of teenagers. So, started off with, positivity for Carmelo, which obviously his side is in support of. But when it got to cross-examination, it just seemed like the prosecution was just ready for everything that this coach had to say and tried to dispute anything that was being said.
Yeah, and I feel like one question that each day we kind of revisit in talking about this is like, why does Carmelo Anthony have a knife at a track meet? And I feel like to this point, like that has yet, and we'll see. They are just beginning to present their case. But even in some of the cross-examinations, like it seems like the prosecution continues to hone in on that in asking questions to whether it's a coach or a teammate of Carmelo Anthony about having this knife at a track meet.
Yeah, Chris, because that question, that's the biggest question, and it hasn't been answered. And, even with the three witnesses today, the second witness was a student and a very good friend of Carmelo. And, it started off, I thought the defense was on a roll. I was like, all right, the defense is coming back now. This student was talking about how at different track meets, they go under tents. He sits under tents all the time. He actually specified that he sat under the memorial tent for several minutes with Carmelo because they had a common friend that was on the track team. So I was like, oh, here's some pushback. Here's, some clarity in the air about this tent culture. Everything's rolling good for the defense. And then the prosecution comes back and asks, 4 or 5 questions. One of those questions being, do you expect a knife to be at a track meet? No, sir. Should a knife be at a track meet? No, sir. Did you expect anything like this to happen? No, sir. Just all these different things addressing the knife situation, which, to the average person seems like common knowledge not to have a weapon on school grounds, no matter if it's legal or not. Just having a weapon, people can legally carry guns, but you can't have them inside a school. You know what I mean? So that's where the prosecution was going every single time the defense tried to get the ball rolling. The prosecution asked those 4 questions that the answers to those questions went in the prosecution's favor and not the defense's.
And I wonder too, because I know, like, kind of going back to one of the state witnesses today who had mentioned that he felt like Austin was trying to intimidate Carmelo Anthony. So, like, eventually it gets to the point where, for whatever reason, he's in this tent. The members of Austin Metcalf's track team, Austin Metcalf, his twin brother, like, they just don't want Carmelo Anthony there. And then they get into this, like, back and forth confrontation. Maybe there's swear words being sent. I know there was, like, some trash talk one student talked about related to, like, football that might have, like, raise things to the next level.
They offer the education, the training, and the self-defense liability insurance so that you can have peace of mind if something happens. And in today's climate, you may need to be legally prepared to face the justice system, no matter how clear a case of self-defense you think you have. Go to uscca.com and see what being a member is all about.
Do you have a side income? No. Do you have a side income?
Actually, yeah, I have an online store.
Wait, seriously? Like you built it yourself?
No, that's the thing. I didn't build anything. They built it for me, thousands of products, already loaded, all shipping from inside the US.
And people are actually buying?
Yeah, I get orders. I didn't run ads. I didn't do anything technical. It just works.
How is that even possible? What's the platform?
It's called Selvia. It's free to start. Forbes covered it. 1.5 million people use it.
Try it now.
But it still seems like there's still this question of like, was Carmelo Anthony in a position where he needed to defend himself
No.
to the point that he pulls a knife out of a backpack and
No.
stabs Austin Metcalf in the chest? And it just seems like we keep getting to this point and you're kind of waiting to hear that other side of the story.
That's exactly what everyone in here is waiting for. It's what I'm waiting for, Chris. I want to hear the other side of the story because everything so far from all the students, all the eyewitness accounts who were there on the scene, not talking about the coaches who were may have been scattered out, across the stadium. We're talking students who were feet away under the same tent. Every last one of them. And let me just address this too, Chris. I mean, I know, the racial aspect of this is a big deal. There have been several Black and Hispanic students, probably the majority of these students have been Black or Hispanic, testifying about these different things, talking about their love for the Metcalf family and what have you. But all of these students come back saying that they didn't even expect anything to happen. They thought it was just, some trash talk, some boys, just going back at it. And everything you've seen before, may have been some profanity. Some say they don't recall profanity. Some say they did. But none of them said that they felt like anything like this was about to happen. One of them even just said they thought, okay, when Austin shoved them, maybe there would have been a shove back and, that would have been it. But every last one said everything happened so fast, and then they didn't even realize what happened until Austin pulls his shirt up and they see a hole in his chest. So to your point, Chris, I'm waiting to hear the defense, whether maybe Carmelo Anthony will take the stand and testify about his own fears, which I would love to hear. I would love to hear both sides. That's how we get a fair trial. But right now, as of now, we haven't really heard anything that results in self-defense by lethal force. In fact, one of the students today said, the question the prosecutor has been asking towards the end, do you feel this was self-defense? Many of the students just say, no, sir. One said, no, that was lethal force versus non-lethal force, which, fair point.
Yeah, and again, like those are kind of just, if you're a juror sitting there and you hear that, how do you counter it from the defense's point of view? And I think of like, does Carmelo Anthony take the stand? And like, we may be like a good ways away from like whether or not that is going to be a possibility. But I do think like every single witness to this point who was there, who saw this, because he's under an opposing team's tent, like these are friends of Austin Metcalf who are testifying. So that is certainly a disadvantage, frankly saying, for Carmelo Anthony and giving his side of the story. And he may be the only one who's able to give his side of the story when it comes to the defense. Before getting to the final witness of today, who I think had like an interesting perspective on things, what did you see from the jury today? Because I know yesterday, the day before, like there were some really emotional moments. You could tell that the jury was getting emotional.
Yeah, not so emotional today, Chris. They were more so focused than anything, especially during the moments they saw those autopsy photos and, Austin Metcalf's heart literally out of his body. I was looking for some kind of visceral reaction, but they just all seemed to just, just sitting there, just looking, just nodding. They're going back and forth. They're walking up and down, the jury box, showing them these photos, explaining what they're seeing and, getting into all the medical terms and everything, which I'm sure, some of them probably received that, but most of them are probably just receiving the visual that they're looking at. But they were just very focused today. Very focused, just, really listening to what was being said in court. Sometimes I'd see their eyes wander to the prosecution's table. They'd wander over, look towards the other side, towards Carmelo Anthony, maybe looking for how he'd respond to any of these things. But nothing really emotional from that jury here today.
Well, and I know from, Austin Metcalf's family, like we've talked about, like his dad at times will put his hand or his head in his hand, and you understand why with that emotion. From the supporters of Carmelo Anthony, I don't know which family members are there behind him in court. Like, what is their emotion as all of this is going on?
It's just strict stoicism, Chris. No crying. I've seen, some men with their arms around what I presume to be their wives or girlfriends or maybe even daughters. There's a collection of them over there, maybe 15 to 20 people on Carmelo's side, same amount over here on the Austin Metcalf side, but they're sitting there, no real tears, no one's really wiping any tears, but really just listening and taking it all in. Just stoic is the only way I can put it.
Now, when it comes to this final witness, we won't say their name because he's 17 years old. He is a student at Memorial High School, which is Austin Metcalf's high school. And in just kind of reading the notes of the day here, when it came to the defense questioning him, he was a defense witness. So this is someone who knew Austin Metcalf, was on the team, and the defense is calling him. He had, I felt like, a little bit of a different perspective of what happened compared to some of the other students from this high school who have taken the stand.
Yeah, Chris, and it was interesting before he took the stand, or right when he took the stand, the defense attorney said that they had not talked before. So, sir, we haven't talked before, but just 2 minutes right now in the hallway. I thought that was interesting because if you're trying to, gain an edge or gain a leg up, why would you have a witness that you haven't done, witness preparations with? But anyway, they start talking, they're walking through the events. It takes them about 20 to 30 minutes to walk through the lead-ups to everything and what this kid saw. And we heard this for the first time today. He said, Carmelo, the whole thing with the hand in the bag and touch me and see what happens. He said that Austin Metcalf tapped Carmelo on the shoulder, like as an annoyance, like, oh yeah, touch me and see what happens. And then he says something that we haven't heard yet. He said, Carmelo said, okay, well, hit me and see what happens, or punch me and see what happens, which we haven't heard that testimony from any student so far. So I'm just wondering, why it was just now said here. We've had over 10 of these student witnesses, and it was just said now during this witness. And then, as he was testifying, he was kind of disagreeing with some of the things that the defense attorney was throwing out. Obviously asking questions to kind of fit the narrative of the defense here with the self-defense claim. And one of their, narratives that they're throwing out is that, these Metcalf boys are some big boys, 6'1", 6'2", linebackers, over 200 pounds. And they started talking about the size comparison thing again, starting to go down that rabbit hole. And they were talking about Austin. Austin was 6'1", 213, according to the medical examiner. And his brother Hunter, the defense is like, well, Hunter was similar in size, trying to make them out to be, the big bullies and all. That's the narrative they're going down. And as the defense attorney is asking this, I can see Jeff Metcalf, the father, just shaking his head like these boys are not the same size. And the young man on the stand said, I wouldn't say that. And he actually said that Austin was substantially bigger than Hunter, which is very interesting because, you're going down this narrative and then you have a witness on the stand that's supposed to be in support of your narrative and he's negating things that you're saying. I don't know how that looks in front of a jury. I imagine it's kind of damaging, maybe not extremely damaging, but it can't be, positive.
Yeah, and I saw this is one of the notes that you put in there. Just something along the line of, you have Hunter, who is apparently, and this is before the incident happens, Hunter is apparently talking to Carmelo Anthony. Austin's tone was moderate, and I guess this student kind of doesn't remember saying this to a detective, but he had recalled at the time something along the lines of Austin said, you better move before I beat your, another word for behind that we can't say here. Which, that is different. That is different than what we heard from some of the other students as far as, if you're talking about the situation that Carmelo was in, that is certainly different than what we've heard from some of the state witnesses that came earlier in the week.
Yeah, and that's a win for the defense if the jury takes it on, because that shows that Austin Metcalf was equally an aggressor here. Because so far, they're all the witnesses with the prosecution. Everyone's, in this agreement that Carmelo was this aggressor. Carmelo was the instigator. Maybe that's a better word. And that Austin was just simply frustrated. But now we're hearing that Austin might have been saying some curse words back to Carmelo, maybe provoking each other, versus just being a one-sided thing. No matter whether Carmelo was randomly there, under the tent or not, we're still talking about the provocation between these two young men, and that's what matters here. What are the facts and the truth surrounding that?
When you look at the cross-examination, though, from the prosecution, and it seemed like that they were almost prepared for this witness and what they were going to say, because there was one line, and I'm just kind of picking one out here, something along the lines of he wasn't anticipating, from the shove that Austin Metcalf gave Carmelo Anthony, he was anticipating a shove back, something along that line.
Yes.
He was not anticipating Carmelo Anthony to pull a knife out and use that type of force. It just seems like the prosecution in some of these cases is prepared for what potentially could be some damaging testimony like what this student talked about.
Exactly, and that's to the point I was making earlier, Chris. When the defense brought this witness up there, he clarified to the court that they hadn't talked before, but then when the prosecution said, oh yeah, we've talked for more than 2 minutes, and I was like, why would the prosecution be talking longer to a defense witness? But they were going down this path, and it seems like the kid was under direct examination versus cross-examination when they came to talking to the prosecution, because the prosecutor was walking down kind of the same questions that he'd been asking their student witnesses when they got on the stand, just establishing the scene. And again, to the point, the line you just pointed out, he was just expecting this shove back. Like, not really concerned. He's kind of watching the races and everything going on, not expecting a knife to get pulled out, and not even being concerned or scared of the situation. You know, he didn't even feel like there was a fight that was going to happen. And he also ended by saying, you know, he did not see Austin Metcalf as wanting to fight. He clearly said in his last answer by the prosecution under cross-examination that he felt Carmelo was in the wrong. That's how the day ended. That was right before the adjournment and the recess right here, right now. So they got a few wins here, Chris, some small wins on the defensive side. I would have, liked to hear more challenges by the defense just to, to make it seem